Now that you've seen how women in medieval times had to navigate a society where their lives were dictated by others, let's turn our attention to a grim reality that everyone in the medieval world had to contend with: hygiene. If you thought living with superstition, violence, and strict social roles was tough, consider this. Personal hygiene, or the complete lack of it, was a major part of daily life and survival. In fact, hygiene in the medieval ages was so poor that it directly impacted people's health, well-being, and even life expectancy. To get a real sense of this, imagine you've just woken up in a cramped, dark, cold room in the middle of winter. The smell hits you immediately: the musty air, the sweat from a long night spent tossing and turning in your woolen garments, the stench of animals who live in your home, and the lingering scent of food that wasn't quite finished off the night before. Personal hygiene wasn't a priority. It wasn't even considered a necessity for most people. Instead, medieval life revolved around mere survival, and staying clean just wasn't on the list of things you could focus on. Now, let's talk about bathing, or more accurately, the lack thereof. In the modern world, most of us bathe daily, but in the medieval world, bathing was a rare event. Public bathhouses did exist in some towns, but they weren't exactly places of cleanliness. Instead, they were often crowded, unsanitary, and breeding grounds for disease. Think about it. Hundreds of people crammed into a single space, sharing the same water, all while bacteria and viruses swirled in the air. Bathhouses, despite their purpose, were notorious for spreading illness, including outbreaks of the plague. In fact, the fear of catching diseases in bathhouses led many people to avoid bathing altogether. It wasn't uncommon for people to go for weeks or even months without a bath. Instead, people would rely on other forms of cleaning, like wiping themselves down with a cloth or using perfumes or herbs to mask body odor. The idea of cleanliness was primarily tied to appearance, rather than actual hygiene. The wealthy might dabble in scented oils, but for most, the scent of sweat, dirt, and animal dung was just a part of daily life. But hygiene wasn't just about bathing, or the lack thereof. It extended to something even more essential: your clothing. Medieval clothing was often made from wool and linen, which were sturdy but also terrible at keeping you fresh. It was hard to wash clothes, as water wasn't easily accessible, and soiled clothing was often worn until it fell apart. This lack of access to proper washing facilities meant that people spent most of their days wearing the same, often rancid, garment. Layers of dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids would build up, making medieval clothing not only uncomfortable, but also a perfect breeding ground for lice, fleas, and other pests. The spread of lice was a constant problem, especially among the lower classes. In fact, if you weren't dealing with lice, you were probably battling fleas or mites, all of which were attracted to the dirty environment that was common in medieval homes. Personal grooming was also a luxury that many couldn't afford. While some people would use rudimentary combs or scratching tools, the idea of a professional grooming service was laughable. For most people, a quick scratch or slap to the skin was all they could manage. Now let's talk about one of the more notorious aspects of medieval hygiene: dental care. You think you have bad teeth? Imagine being a medieval villager with absolutely no access to dentists, toothpaste, or modern oral hygiene practices. The concept of brushing your teeth didn't exist. Instead, people would occasionally rinse their mouths with vinegar or rinse their teeth with rough cloths or sticks, hoping it would clean them. If you got a toothache, your best bet was to either wait for it to go away or have the offending tooth pulled out without any form of anesthesia. And let's not even talk about how common tooth decay, gum disease, and bad breath were. By the time you reached adulthood, your teeth would likely be rotting away, and you'd probably have to rely on herbal remedies just to dull the pain. Historians still debate why medieval hygiene was so poor. Some argue that people didn't have the knowledge or resources to improve their practices, while others believe that hygiene just wasn't a priority in a world where disease and survival took precedence. What's clear, however, is that the lack of proper hygiene made life in medieval times even more dangerous. People were constantly vulnerable to disease, and infections could easily spread when people weren't taking basic precautions. But the real kicker here is that while hygiene was often neglected, certain societal groups, like monks or nobles, had a bit more access to cleanliness. For instance, the wealthy had access to more clothing, better food, and sometimes private bathhouses or running water in their homes, though they still weren't exactly the epitome of cleanliness. On the other hand, peasants and serfs who lived in close quarters with animals and had very little access to fresh water had no choice but to live in unsanitary conditions. The disparity between the upper and lower classes in terms of hygiene was staggering, and as a result, the lower classes were more susceptible to diseases, infestations, and infections. The lack of hygiene during the Middle Ages wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a public health disaster. The world may have been less connected, but even the most remote village was susceptible to outbreaks of disease, and in a world where medical knowledge was limited at best, hygiene, or the lack thereof, was one of the major factors that contributed to the high mortality rates. Without proper sanitation, people were exposed to diseases like cholera, dysentery, and plague, which often decimated entire communities. What's even more staggering is that this situation lasted for centuries, as people continued to live in squalor, without any real understanding of the connection between hygiene and health. Historians still argue whether medieval hygiene was a result of ignorance or simply a product of the time. Some believe that people in the Middle Ages were just as capable of improving hygiene as we are, but lacked the proper knowledge and resources. Others argue that medieval societies' focus on survival and religion, rather than science or cleanliness, left little room for advancements in personal hygiene. Either way, one thing is clear: living in the Middle Ages wasn't just uncomfortable because of the weather or lack of modern amenities, it was downright unhealthy. Now that we've explored the dire state of hygiene, let's step into another unpleasant reality of medieval life: the food, or rather, the lack of it. If you think that living in a time without the comforts of modern conveniences was difficult, imagine what it was like to try and survive on the meager, monotonous, and often unappetizing diet that people in the Middle Ages had to endure. The food you ate wasn't just limited by what was available, it was shaped by what you could afford, and it was far from satisfying. First, let's talk about what the average peasant would be eating. If you were a peasant or a serf, you didn't have the luxury of a varied diet. Your main sustenance would come from grains, mainly barley, oats, or rye, which were often ground into flour and used to make basic bread or porridge. But this wasn't the type of soft, fluffy bread that we're used to today. Medieval bread was dense, coarse, and often a bit stale. It was made with whole grains which were less refined, and because of the limited access to fresh ingredients, it had a gritty texture. If you were fortunate enough to get a loaf of white bread, it meant you were part of the privileged classes. But for most peasants, it was a far cry from what we'd consider a meal. In addition to bread, peasants would eat what they could grow or raise themselves. This meant vegetables like cabbage, onions, and peas, all of which were grown in their small plots of land. Sometimes you'd be lucky enough to have some fruit, but even that was seasonal, so your diet would be incredibly limited during the long winter months. You'd eat what was preserved, salted meats, dried fish, or pickled vegetables option. But fresh, hearty meals were rare, especially during the colder months when crops weren't growing. And then there was the issue of meat. If you were a commoner, meat wasn't something you'd enjoy on a regular basis. Animals like pigs, cows, and chickens were expensive to raise and maintain, so they were usually reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Most peasants could only afford meat during festivals or feasts, and even then, it was usually a small amount. The rich, on the other hand, ate a diet that included plenty of meat: beef, venison, and game birds. But again, this was reserved for the noble classes. Historians still debate how the medieval diet impacted people's health. On one hand, the high-carb, low-protein diet of the poor could lead to malnutrition and a lack of energy. On the other hand, the rich had diets full of meat, rich sauces, and fine pastries, but they still faced health issues. The nobility, while they ate better, often suffered from obesity, gout, and other diseases associated with rich foods. But no matter your class, food was often unappetizing, poorly prepared, and difficult to come by. But don't think you could escape these culinary hardships by seeking out more exotic fare. What we would now consider a tasty treat, such as spices or sweets, was reserved for the very wealthy. Sugar wasn't a common ingredient for most people. It was an expensive luxury. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were imported and highly prized. You might catch a whiff of their rich aroma if you lived in the courts of kings or were lucky enough to be part of a noble household. But for the average peasant, these were just myths of the rich and powerful. The culinary deprivation didn't end with scarcity. It extended to the preparation of food. Since medieval kitchens lacked modern conveniences like refrigeration and ovens, the process of cooking was labor-intensive and often unsanitary. The most common way of cooking was over an open fire, which meant your meals were either roasted or boiled in large pots. There was no such thing as a quick, nutritious dinner. Cooking was an all-day affair, and the food was usually bland, overcooked, or both. In fact, many people simply ate to survive, not to enjoy the taste of their food. Food wasn't something to savor, it was a necessity, something to keep you going until the next day. And let's not forget about the perils of spoiled food. Without refrigeration, food would go bad quickly. Dairy products were particularly problematic. Milk would spoil quickly, and if it wasn't consumed fresh, it would be turned into cheese or butter, both of which had limited shelf lives. But unfortunately, the risk of foodborne illness was high, especially in a world where hygiene and sanitation were lacking. Many people contracted illnesses from contaminated food or water, and spoiled meat or dairy could be deadly. The idea of food safety was completely alien to medieval people, and their lack of knowledge about proper food preservation and handling meant that many died from the very thing that was supposed to sustain them. But not everyone had it as bad as the peasants. The nobility, as mentioned earlier, had access to a much better selection of food, but even they faced challenges. While their meals included meats and fine pastries, they too were limited by the lack of proper storage and the seasonal availability of ingredients. The rich, however, could afford to import fresh fruits, vegetables, and luxury items from across Europe, and they often dined on exotic animals like swan or peacock. Banquets were common in the courts of kings and nobles, where lavish feasts were held. But even so, the hygiene and preservation issues still meant that foodborne illness was a constant threat. So, surviving medieval life wasn't just about dodging plagues, avoiding bandits, or living under a brutal feudal system. It was also about constantly battling hunger, eating poorly prepared food, and living with the specter of foodborne diseases. You had to be resourceful and resilient just to make it through each day, hoping that you could find enough to eat, or at least something to keep you going. Historians still debate whether medieval diets contributed to the shorter lifespans of people during this time. Some believe that malnutrition and food scarcity were major factors that led to early deaths, while others argued that disease, war, and poor hygiene played a more significant role. Regardless, one thing is clear. Food was a constant challenge in the medieval world, and surviving on it wasn't just about hunger. It was about the very real danger of sickness and death. So far, we've explored the daily struggles of medieval life, from the constant threat of disease to the rigid social structure that dictated every aspect of existence. But now, let's shift our focus to a darker aspect of the era that will chill you to your bones: punishment and execution. If you thought surviving the medieval world was tough, imagine being caught in a crime, or worse, accused of something you didn't do. The system of justice in the Middle Ages was brutal, and punishment was often as much about public spectacle as it was about actually seeking justice. Let's start with the concept of crime and punishment. In medieval society, the legal system wasn't exactly designed to be fair or just. There was little to no separation between the church and the law, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty didn't exist. Instead, accusations often led straight to a trial, where the verdict was determined by the whims of the local lord, the church, or whoever held power. If you were accused of a crime, you had very little chance of defending yourself, and the punishment was often swift and severe. One of the most infamous forms of punishment was public execution. If you were convicted of a serious crime, like theft, treason, or heresy, your fate was likely sealed, and the execution would serve as both your punishment and a warning to others. But it wasn't just about dying. It was about the spectacle of your death. Public executions were often huge events, attended by hundreds if not thousands of people. Imagine being dragged to a town square, surrounded by a jeering crowd, and then being executed in front of them. It wasn't just about your punishment. It was about making an example of you. The methods of execution were varied, but they were all designed to be as gruesome as possible. Beheading, hanging, and burning at the stake were common, but there were also more elaborate methods of torture. One particularly horrific form of execution was being drawn and quartered, which was used for high-profile criminals like traitors. The condemned person would be hanged until near death, then disemboweled, and finally their body would be cut into 4 pieces, which would be displayed as a gruesome reminder of the consequences of defying the crown or the church. And if death wasn't the punishment, torture was often used to extract confessions or punish those considered guilty of crimes. The rack was a popular tool of torture, where the victim's limbs would be stretched beyond their breaking point. Or perhaps you were unlucky enough to have your skin stripped away with hot irons or sharp instruments. These torturous methods were intended to make you confess, and many people, after enduring these unspeakable acts, would confess to crimes they didn't commit just to stop the pain. It wasn't justice. It was cruel. But even those who didn't end up facing the executioner had to contend with the harsh reality of medieval punishment. Lesser crimes like theft or adultery often resulted in public humiliation. If you were caught stealing, you might be branded with a mark on your face or hands, marking you for life as a criminal. Sometimes the punishment was even more humiliating, being put in the stocks where your hands and feet were locked into wooden restraints, and you were left exposed to the ridicule and abuse of passers-by. You'd stand there, helpless, for hours, sometimes even days, while people threw rotten food at you or spat on you. It was more than a punishment. It was a way to break your spirit. In some places, particularly in England, criminals were also forced to undergo the ordeal process. This could involve holding a hot iron or walking across hot coals, and if you emerged without injury, it was believed to be a sign that God had forgiven you. It was a ridiculous form of justice, but it was taken seriously, and many innocent people were subjected to these horrific tests. And if you were lucky enough to survive, you might still be branded as a criminal, simply because of the archaic system of justice that ruled the land. The medieval justice system was, in a word, barbaric. There was no sense of fairness or equality before the law, and punishment was designed not just to remove criminals from society, but to create an atmosphere of fear. People lived in constant dread of being accused of something, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. If you were unfortunate enough to get caught up in the legal system, your chances of surviving the ordeal, whether through torture or execution, were slim. Historians still argue about how effective medieval punishment was in maintaining law and order. Some believe that it was an efficient way of keeping the peace by instilling fear in the populace. Others argue that it was simply a means of consolidating power and control over the lower classes. One thing is for sure: the medieval system of justice didn't seek rehabilitation or fairness. It sought control, punishment, and public spectacle. The psychological toll of living in such a brutal system cannot be underestimated. Imagine growing up knowing that any misstep, any rumor, could result in a violent death or unbearable torture. Even if you were a law-abiding citizen, you couldn't escape the constant fear of being accused, and there was always the looming possibility that you might be dragged to the town square, subjected to the whims of a power-hungry lord, or burned alive for a crime you didn't commit. Punishment in the medieval world wasn't just about keeping people in line. It was about instilling fear and ensuring that everyone knew their place. If you were born into a lower class, your life could be snuffed out in an instant, and the chances of escaping such a fate were slim. Even the most powerful nobles weren't immune. One wrong move, one misstep, and they could end up like so many others, executed in front of a crowd, their bodies serving as a grim reminder of the harsh reality of medieval justice. Now that you've seen the dark and brutal side of medieval justice, let's take a look at another facet of life that would make your heart race with anxiety: warfare. The Middle Ages were an era of constant conflict, where wars, raids, and invasions were so frequent that it seemed like there was always a battle brewing somewhere in the background of everyday life. You might have thought that surviving illness, hunger, and the rigid social structure was bad enough, but living through the almost incessant violence of medieval warfare would have pushed your survival instincts to their limits. Imagine this. You're living in a medieval village, trying to make ends meet with your meager crop, when suddenly, the sound of distant horns echoes through the hills. You know what that means. An enemy army is approaching. It could be an invading force from a neighboring kingdom, or it could be a band of marauding soldiers, out to pillage and burn everything in their path. The first instinct of everyone in the village is to flee, but where could you go? There's no safety, no sanctuary to run to. Just the wilderness, and the knowledge that the enemy will be on your heels soon enough. War was a constant threat in the Middle Ages, and almost everyone had to deal with it in some form. Whether you were a peasant, a knight, or a noble, you could never escape the bloodshed that seemed to permeate the era. If you were a peasant, your main concern was avoiding the invading armies that frequently ransacked villages for food, valuables, and any other resources they could carry away. It wasn't uncommon for villages to be completely wiped out during these raids, with everything burned to the ground, livestock stolen, and the inhabitants either killed or taken prisoner. But even if you weren't a peasant, you still had to contend with the constant violence of medieval warfare. Nobles and knights spent much of their lives preparing for battle, learning the arts of war, and arming themselves for the inevitable conflicts that would come. It wasn't just about the occasional skirmish. Wars could go on for years, with armies constantly fighting over land, power, and influence. And when a knight went into battle, they weren't just going to a war, they were going to a slaughterhouse. The brutality of medieval warfare can be seen in the weapons used. Swords, spears, and axes were common, but the real terror came from siege weapons and the longbow. If you were unlucky enough to be caught in a siege, you might find yourself under attack by massive stone-throwing machines that could reduce walls to rubble. And even if you made it past the initial attack, you'd face starvation and disease. Siege warfare was as much about psychological endurance as it was about military strength, and often the outcome was determined not by who was the better fighter, but who could hold out the longest. Historians still debate how medieval warfare evolved over the centuries. Some argue that knights and mounted cavalry were the dominant forces, while others believe that common soldiers wielding longbows or crossbows had a significant advantage in battle. Either way, one thing is clear: surviving the constant warfare of the medieval period would have been incredibly difficult. Even if you weren't directly involved in the battles, you could easily find yourself caught in the middle of someone else's war. What made medieval warfare particularly horrific was its unpredictability. If you were a civilian, you could never know when your town or village would be attacked. There were no warning systems, no signs that an invading force was coming. Villages were often at the mercy of the local lord or king, who might decide to go to war without much regard for the well-being of the people under their protection. Even if you lived in a castle, the threat of war was ever present. If your lord decided to defend their land against an invader, you'd be dragged into the conflict, even if you had no personal stake in the matter. But the real terror wasn't just in the battles themselves. It was in the aftermath. If you survived the fighting, there was a good chance that your land would be destroyed, your food supplies would be depleted, and your family would be scattered. The medieval period wasn't just about fighting. It was about survival in a world where there were no guarantees. If you were lucky, you might have a roof over your head and a meager meal to eat, but your life would be defined by the constant possibility of war. Even if you lived through one battle, you knew that another was always waiting just around the corner. The psychological toll of constant warfare is something that's often overlooked. People who lived through the medieval period didn't just suffer physically, they suffered emotionally. The fear of invasion, the terror of battle, and the stress of living in a world where violence was a constant presence took its toll on the mind. Even if you didn't fight, the threat of being caught in a war was ever present. The emotional scars of medieval warfare would have been just as painful as the physical ones. Historians still argue about how the effects of medieval warfare shaped the societies of the time. Some believe that it created a culture of fear and militarism, while others argue that it spurred innovation in tactics and weaponry. Regardless, the reality was clear. Warfare in the Middle Ages was a constant, brutal force that shaped the lives of everyone, from the highest nobility to the lowest peasant. By now, you've learned how medieval warfare and the constant threat of conflict could make survival feel impossible. But there's another key aspect of medieval life that deserves attention: living in a castle. It's easy to imagine the towering, imposing stone structures as symbols of power and safety. But the reality of living in a medieval castle wasn't as glamorous as it's often depicted in stories. Castles were designed to keep enemies out, but they weren't exactly places of comfort, and the people who lived there, even the nobility, faced their own set of struggles. First, let's talk about the physical environment inside a medieval castle. Picture this: cold, damp stone walls, narrow windows that let in very little light, and thick, heavy doors. Castles weren't built for luxury, they were built for defense. In fact, the very design of a castle was intended to make it as difficult as possible for enemies to breach. High walls, towers, drawbridges, and moats were all part of the design to make it hard for attackers to gain access. But while these features were great for protection, they weren't exactly practical for day-to-day living. The first thing you'd notice when entering a castle is the temperature, or rather, the lack of warmth. Castles were drafty and often freezing, especially in the winter. With thick stone walls and little insulation, heat from fires couldn't travel far. The hearths in the Great Hall were the primary source of warmth, but they could only heat a limited space, meaning most of the rooms, including the sleeping quarters, were cold and uncomfortable. Suddenly, the TVs began to blare. He put Rick's hand to his head, hopeful for a moment, as if he would see the ravine with the figured water falling from it. And if you were part of the lower ranks, say a servant or a squire, you'd be stuck in even more cramped and uncomfortable quarters, far from the warmth of the main hall. The furniture in a medieval castle was basic at best. You wouldn't be lounging on plush sofas or sleeping on a soft mattress. Most of the furniture consisted of hard wooden tables and chairs, with benches for sitting. The beds, if you were lucky enough to have one, would have been simple wooden frames with a thin mattress stuffed with straw or feathers. There was no such thing as a comfortable night's sleep. In fact, the bedding would be infested with lice, fleas, and other pests, adding another layer of discomfort to life inside the castle walls. Historians still debate whether the nobles of the medieval period truly lived in luxury, or if their castles were just as uncomfortable as those of the peasants. While the aristocracy had access to more resources and better food, their living conditions were still harsh. Many castles were located in isolated rural areas, far from any urban conveniences. Even the nobility had to endure the difficulties of living in an environment that was more about survival than comfort. But it wasn't just the lack of comfort that made life in a castle difficult. It was also the constant threat of danger. While castles were designed to protect their inhabitants from outside invaders, they weren't foolproof. If you were living in a castle, you were always aware that, at any moment, you could be under siege. Castles were often involved in wars, and it wasn't uncommon for them to be attacked by rival lords or foreign invaders. During a siege, your castle might be surrounded by enemy troops, leaving you with limited supplies, no access to fresh food or water, and the constant fear of starvation or capture. Inside the castle walls, the day-to-day life wasn't all about defense. Castles were also centers of power and control. The lord and his family would have their court, complete with advisors, knights, and various servants. The lord's role was to maintain control over the surrounding lands and people, and the castle was the hub of this activity. If you were a servant or a knight living in the castle, you would spend your days performing various tasks, from serving food to defending the castle from attacks. The work was often grueling, and the stakes were high. If you failed in your duties, the consequences could be severe, and you could lose your position or even your life. But the role of the castle wasn't just about power, it was also about protecting wealth. Castles were often surrounded by farmland, where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection from the lord. If you were a peasant living under the protection of a castle, your life wasn't necessarily easy. You had to work long hours in the fields, but the lord would offer protection from bandits or invaders in return for your labor. However, the reality of this protection was not always as it seemed. If the castle was under siege, you could find yourself trapped, with no access to food or water. The safety of the castle was an illusion that could crumble at any moment. Living in a castle was also a constant reminder of your social status. Nobles, knights, and their families lived in the largest, most fortified parts of the castle, with private chambers, dining rooms, and chapels. They had access to luxuries like wine, meat, and fresh fruits. Meanwhile, servants and soldiers lived in cramped, dark rooms with little privacy or comfort. The castle was a microcosm of medieval society where social hierarchy was rigid and unyielding. The higher your rank, the better your accommodations, but even the highest-ranking individuals had to deal with the harsh realities of castle life. What about the castle's role as a center of entertainment? If you were lucky, you might experience some form of leisure inside the walls. The lord and his family would often host banquets, feasts, and celebrations, but even these events were not all they seemed. They were often political affairs where alliances were forged and power was displayed. The entertainment, whether it was minstrels, jesters, or knights competing in jousts, wasn't about relaxation. It was about demonstrating power and wealth. The grandeur of these events was simply a mask for the harsh realities that lay behind the stone walls. Historians still argue about the nature of life inside castles, whether it was truly a symbol of luxury and power, or if it was a hard, harsh existence, even for the nobility. Regardless of the debate, one thing is certain: living in a castle during the Middle Ages was far from easy. It was a life filled with danger, discomfort, and constant reminders of your place in a rigid social structure. After taking a closer look at the harsh reality of living in a castle, let's shift gears to something that would send chills down anyone's spine: the terrifying spectacle of public executions and flogging. You may think that public punishments were things of the past, relegated to ancient times, but in medieval society, executions were very much part of the cultural fabric, and often a form of entertainment. The spectacle of seeing a person tortured or executed in front of a crowd was not just a way to punish criminals. It was a public event, one that brought both fear and excitement to the onlookers. Imagine this. You're standing in the town square, surrounded by hundreds of people, all craning their necks to get a better view of what's about to happen. The atmosphere is thick with anticipation. You know that someone is about to face their fate, but you don't know who or how. The criminals, or sometimes just the accused, are dragged into the square, often bound in chains, their heads bowed in shame. The crowd murmurs in excitement as the executioner steps forward, axe in hand, or the gallows are erected in the background. Public executions were not just about punishing wrongdoers. They were a public spectacle, a way to demonstrate power and maintain control. The act of execution was a statement. This is what happens if you defy the law or the ruling authority. Whether it was a beheading, hanging, or burning at the stake, the methods of execution were designed to be as dramatic as possible. meant to inspire fear and ensure that the rest of the population behaved accordingly. The fact that people gathered in crowds to watch this horror unfold was, in itself, a testament to how desensitized society had become to suffering and cruelty. Take, for instance, the infamous punishment of burning at the stake. This was often reserved for those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or other crimes that went against the teachings of the church. The condemned person would be tied to a wooden post, surrounded by a pile of kindling. As the fire was lit, the person would slowly burn to death, often while the crowd looked on, sometimes cheering or shouting. The brutality of this punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Being burned alive was a gruesome way to die, and it was meant to make an example out of those who threatened the social and religious order. And it wasn't just executions that filled the public squares with terror. Flogging was another common form of punishment. If you were accused of a lesser crime, like theft or adultery, you might be tied to a post and whipped in front of a crowd. The lashings would tear into your skin, leaving you bruised and bloody as the crowd jeered and taunted you. These public flogging sessions weren't just about pain, they were about humiliation. They were the whippings that resulted thousands of years ago in human. The punishment didn't end when the whipping stopped. The criminal would often be left in public view, a visible reminder to others of what could happen if they crossed the line. Historians still argue about the role of public executions and corporal punishment in medieval society. Some believe these punishments were effective in maintaining order, a necessary means of controlling a largely illiterate and unregulated population. Others argue that they were simply a tool for the powerful to maintain their dominance, using fear and spectacle to keep the masses in check. One thing is certain, the brutality of medieval punishment reflected the dark, unforgiving nature of the time. Justice, if it could even be called that, wasn't about rehabilitation or fairness. It was about power and fear. But even those who weren't punished by execution or flogging weren't entirely safe. The threat of violence was ever present, and just being accused of a crime could lead to a brutal and often irreversible fate. Imagine living in a world where the mere accusation of wrongdoing could lead to torture, public humiliation, or death. Even if you were innocent, there was no guarantee that the law would protect you. The medieval system of justice wasn't based on evidence or reason. It was based on power, politics, and fear. What's even more unsettling is that some of the most common crimes in medieval society, such as theft or adultery, were punished with the same ferocity as treason or heresy. There was no differentiation between crimes of survival and crimes of malice. If you were caught stealing food to feed your starving family, you could find yourself on the receiving end of a punishment that might cost you your life. And if you were accused of something as simple as cheating on your spouse, you could be subjected to public humiliation, flogging, or worse. In many ways, public executions and corporal punishment were a means of social control. The medieval ruling class understood that fear was a powerful tool. By making an example of those who violated the law, they reinforced the idea that defying authority would have dire consequences. The spectacle of a public execution wasn't just about punishing one person. It was about instilling fear in everyone else, reminding them that their lives were always under the watchful eyes of the law and the church. Historians still debate whether these forms of punishment were effective in preventing crime, or if they simply created a society of fear and resentment. What we do know is that the people who lived in medieval times were constantly reminded of the powerlessness they had under the law. If you were a commoner, your life was at the mercy of those in power, and any mistake or misstep could lead to your downfall. As we wrap up our journey through the harsh realities of medieval life, let's take a moment to focus on something that has remained a central part of human existence throughout history: superstition. While we've already seen how the fear of witches and magical practices could shape people's lives, there was much more to the medieval worldview. Superstition wasn't just confined to belief in witches or demons. It was woven into almost every aspect of life, from medicine to daily chores, and even to how people explained the most mundane events. Imagine waking up in a medieval village. You step outside your small, cramped home and immediately look up at the sky. Is it cloudy? Sunny? Is there a strange pattern in the clouds? These weren't just weather observations. They were signs. A cloud formation could signal good or bad fortune. The flight pattern of birds could be a prophecy, offering warnings or blessings. Everything in the medieval world had meaning, and most of it was tied to superstition. Superstition in the Middle Ages wasn't just about witchcraft or magical rituals. It was a way of understanding a world that was otherwise unpredictable, dangerous, and often brutal. For example, if a child was born with a birthmark, it might be interpreted as a sign of a past life or the mark of a demonic influence. Any odd occurrence, from a bad harvest to a sudden illness, was likely attributed to something supernatural rather than a more rational explanation. This belief system offered a sense of control over an otherwise uncontrollable world. It was comforting to think that events had a reason, even if that reason wasn't grounded in reality. At the same time, this superstition created fear. Imagine the paranoia that could arise from a seemingly random event. A neighbor falls ill, and suddenly accusations of witchcraft start flying. A strange death could be the result of a curse. A famine? Surely the work of an angry god or evil sorcery. People lived in constant fear of invisible forces, demons, witches, and even the wrath of saints. The fear of being cursed or marked in some way was pervasive. It wasn't enough to simply survive in medieval times. You had to protect yourself from the supernatural forces that could strike at any moment. But superstition didn't just affect how people interpreted illness or misfortune. It influenced their approach to medicine, too. Medieval people often turned to magical or ritualistic methods of healing. Herbs, charms, and incantations were used in an attempt to cure everything from minor illnesses to serious diseases. Some of these remedies were based on ancient, often outdated, knowledge. For example, if you had a headache, you might have been prescribed a potion made from powdered skulls or animal parts. If you had a wound, it might be treated with a mixture of goat's blood and bat wings. But the reality was that many of these treatments did nothing to heal, and often made matters worse. The medieval approach to health wasn't just about the remedies, it was also about the rituals. For example, if you had a chronic illness, you might seek out a healer or priest to perform a ritualistic prayer or blessing. You could also wear a protective amulet or pendant, hoping that it would shield you from the evil eye or a curse. These practices were so deeply ingrained in medieval society that for most people they were seen as a natural part of life. It wasn't just about finding a cure, it was about appeasing the forces that controlled your fate. Historians still debate the extent to which superstition shaped medieval society. Some argue that it was a coping mechanism for a population facing overwhelming hardships. Others suggest that superstition was manipulated by the ruling powers, such as the church or local lords, to maintain control over the masses. Regardless of the reasons, the prevalence of superstition in the medieval world is undeniable. It shaped not only how people lived their everyday lives, but also how they understood their place in the universe. But superstition also influenced something far more personal, how people dealt with their own fears and mortality. The belief in an afterlife was powerful during the Middle Ages, and it shaped how people lived and died. If you were a peasant, the idea of a better life after death was often the only comfort you had. If you were a noble, your focus might have been on securing your place in heaven through acts of charity and devotion. But for most, the fear of eternal damnation was just as terrifying as the fear of physical death. The church had a firm grip on people's spiritual lives, and its teachings were often used to instill fear of the supernatural. A person's fate, both in this world and the next, was believed to be in the hands of God, and the church acted as his representative on earth. "Yeah," the prince said, as he turned to his representative on earth. Despite the all-encompassing influence of superstition, not everyone in medieval society believed in the supernatural. Scholars, monks, and intellectuals began questioning long-held beliefs and advocating for a more rational approach to understanding the world. But these voices were often drowned out by the overwhelming power of the church and the deeply ingrained superstitions of the common people. It wasn't until the later Middle Ages that intellectual movements like scholasticism began to challenge these superstitions. But by then, much of Europe had already been deeply shaped by centuries of belief in the mystical and the unknown. In many ways, superstition and religion became intertwined, and people's fear of the unknown was often channeled through religious practices. If something went wrong in your life, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a sign that you had angered God, or that you were being punished for something you had done. Healing wasn't just about medicine, it was about penance and prayer. These beliefs, whether rooted in superstition or religion, created an atmosphere where fear and uncertainty were constant companions. Historians still argue about how deeply medieval people were influenced by superstition. Some suggest that it was a natural response to living in an unpredictable world. Others argue that superstition was a tool of social control used to manipulate the masses. But one thing is clear. The medieval period was shaped by a complex web of beliefs that combined religion, magic, and fear. In a world where disease, death, and warfare were ever present, superstition provided an explanation for the unexplainable, and a way for people to cope with a harsh and uncertain existence. As we reach the final section of our journey through medieval life, let's reflect on how this dark and tumultuous era eventually gave way to change and transformation. The Middle Ages, with all their brutal realities, disease, war, rigid social hierarchies, public punishment, and superstition, would not last forever. Slowly, and often painfully, this period gave way to the Renaissance, a time of intellectual, artistic, and scientific rebirth. But what really marked the end of the medieval world? How did the medieval mindset evolve, and what forces set the stage for the world to transition into something new? To understand this transformation, we need to take a step back and think about what kept the medieval world stagnant for so long. The overwhelming power of the church, with its control over both spiritual and political life, played a key role. The church, while providing some structure and guidance, also limited intellectual freedom, often stifling scientific and philosophical advancements. Education was confined to the clergy and the wealthy elite, and the common folk remained largely illiterate and superstitious. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, cracks began to appear in this rigid system. One of the most important catalysts for change was the development of trade and the growth of towns and cities. As merchants traveled, they brought new ideas and knowledge from the East and the classical world. The introduction of new technologies like the printing press allowed knowledge to spread more quickly and widely than ever before. Suddenly, people could read books that were no longer confined to the hands of the clergy. Ideas about science, philosophy, and humanism began to take root, and people started questioning the old ways of thinking. Historians still debate what triggered the end of the medieval period. Some argue that it was the Black Death itself, which killed off so many people that it forced society to rethink its structure. Others point to the rise of powerful monarchs and centralized governments, which helped weaken the influence of local lords in the church. But there's little doubt that the Renaissance, ushered in by thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, and Martin Luther, represented a turning point in human history. As the Renaissance unfolded, so did a newfound focus on humanism, which emphasized the potential of human beings and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. This philosophy slowly replaced the medieval worldview, which had centered on a constant fear of the divine and the supernatural. With the rise of humanism, the value of individual experience, reason, and empirical evidence began to take precedence over superstition and religious dogma. Slowly, the medieval fear of the unknown began to be replaced by a desire for understanding. But it wasn't just ideas that were changing. The medieval social structure was also starting to fracture. The rigid feudal system, where your life was determined by birth and loyalty, gave way to a more fluid social order. The rise of the merchant class, the beginnings of modern capitalism, and the advent of exploration all contributed to a more dynamic and interconnected world. By the time the Renaissance fully took hold, the feudal order had crumbled, and new forms of government and society were beginning to take shape. Of course, this transition wasn't easy. The Middle Ages didn't just end overnight, and the people who lived through it didn't just wake up one day in the modern world. The Renaissance came with its own set of challenges. New ideas were often met with resistance, especially from the Church, which saw these changes as a threat to its authority. The Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses, was a direct challenge to the Church's power, and it led to a split in Christianity that would forever change the religious landscape of Europe. But despite the resistance, the shift toward a more enlightened, human-centered worldview took hold. The printing press made books and ideas more accessible. Universities and intellectual circles flourished, and artists and scientists began to make groundbreaking discoveries that would shape the modern world. People started to question the medieval understanding of the universe and began to look at the world through the lens of reason and evidence rather than superstition and fear. Historians still argue about whether the Renaissance truly marked the end of the medieval era, or if it was simply a continuation of the changes that had been bubbling beneath the surface for centuries. Some see the Renaissance as a clean break from the past, while others argue that it was more of a slow, gradual evolution. What is clear, however, is that the medieval world, with its rigid beliefs, constant violence, and harsh realities, laid the foundation for the world we know today. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, the journey toward the modern age was a long, slow process, one that required people to overcome centuries of fear, superstition, and suffering. But it was this period of transformation that allowed humanity to begin to think beyond survival and toward progress. The medieval world may have been a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was also a world that set the stage for the incredible developments that would follow. So, as we close the door on the medieval period, it's important to remember that the people who lived through it weren't simply passive victims of circumstance. They fought, they survived, and they endured. And in doing so, they helped pave the way for the world we live in today. The Middle Ages, with all its brutality and hardship, was a necessary part of our shared history, a history that continues to shape our understanding of the world. Now, as you drift off to sleep, let the echoes of the past fade away, and let the promise of tomorrow's progress comfort you. The medieval world was hard, unforgiving, and brutal, but it also gave birth to the light of reason, the beauty of art, and the hope of a better future. Sweet dreams. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where the simplest day-to-day tasks were life or death struggles. Picture yourself trudging through a medieval village, muddy streets, the smell of filth wafting through the air, and your feet constantly sinking into muck. It's not exactly a cozy retreat, and you can probably guess you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. I'm curious to see how far we've traveled tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In medieval times, everything about life was rough. You wouldn't just survive by chance, you'd be fighting a losing battle from the get-go. Life was dirty, unhealthy, and incredibly unforgiving. Let's dive into this. Imagine walking down the streets of a medieval town. The cobblestones are slick with a mix of mud, sewage, and the remnants of animals. The smell? Well, it's a blend of unwashed bodies, livestock, and food waste, all congealing together in a thick, oppressive atmosphere. Personal hygiene was not exactly a top priority, more like a distant afterthought. In fact, bathing was an infrequent luxury, not a regular habit. Water sources were often contaminated, and since running water was a dream for most, people didn't exactly have the means to keep themselves clean. Think about it, the streets are full of waste, but no one seems to notice because they've grown numb to the constant stench. Let's say you made it out of the street. Good job. You're still alive. But that's just the beginning. And here's the kicker. If you were unlucky enough to live in this time, you'd also be fighting an invisible enemy, disease, without access to proper sanitation, and with people living in close quarters with animals, illnesses spread like wildfire. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for entire towns to be wiped out by outbreaks that we would now consider minor. But back then, every sniffle, every cough, was a potential death sentence. You're probably thinking, well, at least I could make it indoors, right? Think again. Let's say you were lucky enough to have a roof over your head. We'll get to castles later. Your home, whether you were a peasant or a lord, was probably damp, poorly lit, and drafty. A hearth might have been your only source of warmth, and that was a fickle thing. Sometimes offering just enough heat to survive, other times it barely kept the chill at bay. With no central heating, every winter felt like a battle against the elements. Historians still argue whether the harshness of medieval life was inevitable or a result of poor leadership and bad infrastructure. But the reality, it was rough, and survival was more about luck and resilience than anything else. But it wasn't just about surviving the elements. It was about the constant threat of violence and conflict. Whether you were part of a peasant revolt or simply caught up in a local skirmish, there was no escaping the bloodshed that seemed to mark the Middle Ages. Everywhere you turned, there was danger. You might have heard of the term feudalism, which is how medieval society worked. It was a system where the land was controlled by lords, and peasants worked that land in exchange for protection. Sounds okay in theory, right? But let's not sugarcoat it. Those who were born into poverty had little hope of escaping it. Serfs lived their entire lives under the control of their lord, bound to the land they worked. You wouldn't even own your house. It was your lord's, and you'd need permission to do almost anything, from getting married to leaving the estate. But wait, what about the people who had money? If you were born into a wealthier family, the odds of you surviving were better, but you'd still face all the dangers of disease, war, and poor living conditions. You may have been able to afford a cleaner life, but let's be real, the luxuries you had didn't extend to an immune system that could fight off all the diseases lurking around every corner. And even with money, your quality of life would still be rough compared to what we take for granted today. What's even more unsettling is that despite all the hardship, there wasn't much to cheer you up. You'd probably spend your days praying for a better life, but even that didn't guarantee you any real peace. If you weren't in church, you were probably doing hard labor, trying to meet your Lord's demands, or working the fields. The sense of relief and freedom we feel today was non-existent. If you had any free time, it was likely filled with fear of what might happen next. In medieval times, survival wasn't about fighting dragons or mythical creatures. It was about battling illness, living in constant discomfort, and most of all, not letting the crushing weight of reality get the best of you. But let's take it one step further. The more I tell you about the medieval world, the clearer it becomes you probably wouldn't survive. But don't just take my word for it. Stick with me, and let's uncover more of the harsh truths together. By now, you're probably starting to realize that medieval life wasn't just uncomfortable, it was often a matter of life and death. And the most lethal thing you could encounter wasn't just some bandit or rogue knight. It was the diseases that ravaged through villages and cities alike. If you thought surviving the harsh living conditions was hard enough, now imagine facing the grim reality of the Black Death, a pandemic that would wipe out millions of people across Europe. It's a chilling thought, but trust me, it was a very real threat during the medieval ages. Now, picture this. The year is 1347, and you live in a bustling town. The air is thick, not just with the stench of human waste and animal filth, but with the whispers of something far more sinister. Plague. The Black Death, as it's known, is already spreading across Europe, and it's only a matter of time before it reaches you. The disease was highly contagious and could strike without warning. One day you might feel a slight fever. but by the next morning your body could be covered in painful boils, your skin turning black as the bacteria ravaged your insides. Within days, you could be gone. The chances of surviving this illness, practically non-existent. Historians still argue over exactly how the Black Death spread, whether through fleas on rats, through the air, or through infected bodily fluids. But one thing is for sure, when it hit, it didn't discriminate. It killed kings and peasants alike, sweeping across Europe at an alarming speed, leaving entire towns deserted, their streets littered with bodies. The numbers are staggering. Estimates suggest that up to 60% of Europe's population perished during this time. If you think that sounds like an impossible scenario, just imagine the panic that would have swept through a town like yours. You would have seen your friends, family, and neighbors fall ill, and with no proper medical understanding, there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The only way people tried to protect themselves was through superstition, burning incense, wearing charms, and praying to saints. But these methods were about as effective as hoping for a miracle. As much as you might wish to escape the horror, it wouldn't matter. The disease moved too quickly and efficiently. In an age without antibiotics, a simple cough could be your undoing. Now, in case you're thinking, well, at least I wouldn't get infected if I stayed home, think again. The medieval world wasn't like today. Your home, even if it had walls, was unlikely to protect you from something as virulent as the Black Death. And if you did try to flee, well, good luck with that. Travel was hardly safe, and without modern transportation, most people were stuck in one place, completely vulnerable. For instance, people living in cities packed closely together were just as likely to catch the disease as those out in the countryside, where it wasn't uncommon to see animals living alongside humans. Yikes. But the Black Death wasn't the only thing lurking around the corner. Other diseases, like smallpox, leprosy, and tuberculosis were also common, and the lack of medical knowledge meant that most people simply didn't know how to treat these afflictions. Imagine walking around with a constant fear of what might be waiting for you. Every cough, every fever, could mean the end. The worst part? There was no sick day. If you couldn't work because of illness, you wouldn't get any sympathy. There was no social safety net to fall back on. No welfare, no health insurance, no one to help you but your family. Or maybe not even them. If the disease spread to them as well, you had to keep going, keep surviving, or risk becoming yet another victim of the disease. And if you did survive, chances are you'd never be the same again, physically or mentally. And if the idea of surviving the plague doesn't sound bad enough, you'd also be contending with the fact that medieval medicine was, to put it mildly, a complete disaster. Picture this. If you were unlucky enough to get sick, you'd probably be treated by someone who believed in things like bloodletting, yes, draining your blood to balance your humors, or by someone with zero actual medical knowledge, like a local healer who relied on herbs and superstition. Some doctors thought that the plague was a punishment from God and that people needed to pray for forgiveness. In fact, some of the worst treatments actually made things worse. And if you were lucky enough to have a doctor who didn't make you worse, well, they likely had no clue how to cure you anyway. Historians still debate whether medieval medicine was more dangerous than helpful, but one thing is clear. It wasn't the kind of care that would help you live a long, healthy life. Instead, it was more likely to make you wish you had never gotten sick in the first place. But surviving the Black Death wasn't your only concern. If you managed to live through the plague and its cousins, you'd still have to deal with the everyday dangers of living in the Middle Ages. Let's talk about that for a moment. The medieval world was rife with conflict, constant warfare, peasant revolts, bandit attacks, and sieges. If you weren't dealing with disease, you were probably hiding from marauders or getting caught up in local feuds. So take a moment and imagine this. You're living through one of the most dangerous periods in human history, and your chances of survival are slim to none. The plague could take you in days, a sword could end you in seconds, and your home was never a safe haven. So, let's step back from the deadly outbreaks for a moment and talk about how medieval life was structured. Surviving the plague might have been one of your worst fears, but even before you had to worry about that, you'd already be stuck in a rigid social system that didn't give a whole lot of freedom. You'd be born into a role, and good luck escaping it. Because you would, life in medieval society was strictly organized by the feudal system, a hierarchy that ruled nearly every aspect of daily life. Now picture this. You're born in the 12th century. Congratulations. Unfortunately, you're also born into a society where your worth is decided the moment you're born. If you were lucky, you might have been born into the nobility, where a life of relative comfort awaited you, if you could call it that. You see, even noble life wasn't exactly all roses. Castles were cold, dark, and damp, with little to no comfort compared to the luxurious homes we take for granted today. If you're living in a castle, there's a good chance your bed was nothing more than a straw mat, and your heating came from a fire that barely managed to warm a single room. But let's say you weren't born into nobility. What if you were born a peasant, like most people during the Middle Ages? Then your fate was pretty much sealed from the moment you took your first breath. You were part of a massive class of serfs. Basically, people who worked the land for their lords in exchange for protection and a place to live. Sounds like a fair deal, right? Except it wasn't. Being a serf wasn't about freedom. It was about surviving from one day to the next. In this feudal world, your social mobility was essentially non-existent. You didn't get to choose your career. Hell, you didn't even get to choose who you married in many cases. Your life was strictly dictated by the land you worked, and you were considered little more than the property of the lord who owned that land. You'd spend your days working the fields, growing crops, taking care of animals, and doing all sorts of back-breaking labor just to scrape by. And of course, your lord would take a significant portion of what you produced, sometimes up to half. No wonder people were constantly on edge, struggling to survive. Historians still debate whether feudalism was as oppressive as it seemed, or if it was simply the only system that could work in such a fragmented, dangerous world. Some argue that the peasants and serfs were at least guaranteed food and protection in exchange for their labor, while others suggest that feudal lords were little more than glorified overlords who exploited their workers for their own gain. Either way, your life wasn't your own. It was always tied to someone else's whims. But there's one more thing to consider. If you were a peasant, your role wasn't just about physical labor. It was about your relationship with the land, the church, and your lord. The church was a massive influence on medieval life. It wasn't just a place of worship. It was a force that controlled everything, from how you spent your time to what you believed about the world. It dictated everything, even your moral compass. If you were lucky enough to be part of the church, maybe as a monk or a priest, you would have had access to some education and a better quality of life, but most people weren't that lucky. In fact, most people couldn't read or write, and the church played a huge role in reinforcing that illiteracy. Knowledge was power, and the church wasn't keen on giving it away. The result, a largely uneducated population, completely reliant on religious teachings to navigate the world. And let's not forget the power of your lord. If you were a serf, you had no say in anything that mattered. Everything you did, your labor, your relationships, even your personal safety was determined by the whims of your lord. If you were one of the few who managed to escape the bonds of feudalism, you could buy your freedom. But that wasn't a common scenario. Most people just stayed put, living and dying in the same place, working for someone else with little hope of breaking free. But what about the occasional lucky break? Was there a chance that you could break free from this system and make something of yourself? Maybe, but your odds were slim. Sometimes peasants could rise through the ranks by gaining the favor of a lord, becoming skilled in a trade, or joining a merchant guild. But those cases were rare, and even when it happened, it often came with major social stigma. People who weren't born into nobility, or didn't make their fortune through luck, had little chance of ascending to higher social ranks. So, surviving in medieval times wasn't just about fighting off disease or avoiding bandits. It was about enduring a system that made it nearly impossible to change your fate. Birth was destiny, and that was a harsh pill to swallow. If you weren't born into privilege, your life would likely be one of hard labor, poverty, and unfulfilled potential. Even in the rare cases where someone did manage to escape their social station, they often found themselves fighting against an entire society that was designed to keep them in their place. Imagine trying to break out of a cage that's been locked for centuries. Good luck. You might struggle, fight, and claw your way out, but in the end, the odds were stacked so high against you that it hardly seemed worth the effort. Now that you've got a taste of the daily grind in medieval society, where your place was pretty much decided from birth, let's turn our attention to something that might make you shudder even more: medieval medicine. If you thought surviving the harsh conditions of medieval life was bad enough, the treatments for any ailments you encountered would make you question whether it was worth getting sick in the first place. Spoiler alert, you wouldn't want to get sick at all. Let's say you wake up one day with a nasty fever. Maybe you're feeling weak, your head is pounding, and you're wondering if it's just a cold or something more serious. Well, in the medieval world, you wouldn't have the luxury of a quick trip to the doctor and a prescription for antibiotics. Instead, you'd likely be taken to a local healer or even a barber surgeon. No, not a barber who just cuts hair, but someone who doubled as a surgeon, and you thought your last visit to the dentist was bad. These medieval doctors didn't have the benefit of modern science. They had limited knowledge of the human body, and most treatments were based on superstition, trial and error, and ancient texts that were often out of date or completely wrong. For instance, if you had a fever, one common medieval treatment was bloodletting. Yes, they would cut you open and drain your body of the bad humors causing your illness. That's not a cure. That's basically giving yourself a chance to get even sicker. Historians still argue whether bloodletting was ever effective. Some say it may have provided a placebo effect, but others believe it did more harm than good. One thing's for sure, if you had a serious illness, chances are you would have been better off just staying in bed and hoping for the best, rather than putting your fate in the hands of someone who thought draining your blood was a smart idea. But let's say you somehow avoided bloodletting. What else could medieval medicine throw at you? Well, in some cases they might have used herbs and potions, some of which were actually beneficial, but most of them weren't. For instance, willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was used for pain relief, and that actually worked. But then there were other concoctions, like potions made from things like leeches, frogs, or even moldy bread. They didn't exactly have the best quality control. And if your illness was something a bit more exotic, like the plague for instance, well, you could expect to be told that you were being punished by God. You might be given charms to wear, or perhaps an amulet, to ward off the evil spirits causing your disease. It's not that medieval people didn't care about their health. They just didn't have a clue about how the body worked. Without the understanding of germs or viruses, most medieval treatments were aimed at appeasing mystical forces, not actually curing what ailed you. If you were unlucky enough to have a broken limb, you'd be in for an uncomfortable experience. They didn't have casts, painkillers, or modern surgical tools. Instead, they would bind your limb with whatever they had available, often with rough materials, and hope it healed correctly. And if it didn't, well, too bad. In some cases, amputations were performed, but again, without any anesthesia. Imagine having to go through that with nothing more than a bit of whiskey to dull the pain. Historians still argue whether the medieval world was more primitive or just misunderstood. There are those who believe the lack of medical knowledge was a product of its time, but others say it was a lack of progress that led to centuries of ineffective treatments. Either way, if you got sick in medieval times, your chances of survival weren't just low because of the illness, you were also at the mercy of ineffective and often harmful treatment. But let's move on from illness for a second. You might have survived a plague or an infection, but there's one thing you couldn't escape: the constant violence of medieval life. If you weren't sick, you were probably dodging bandits, getting caught up in local feuds, or watching your home be burned to the ground during a war. Life was brutal, and there was never any guarantee of safety. Medieval society was in constant turmoil. You had constant warfare, with neighboring kingdoms waging battles for land and power. If you lived in a town or city, chances were you'd be caught up in a siege at some point, where your home would be surrounded and your food and water supplies would dwindle. If you were living on the countryside, you were vulnerable to raids from both local lords and marauding invaders like the Vikings or Mongols. Even if you managed to avoid the violence, you'd have to deal with the fear of being attacked. Imagine living in a world where there was no police force, no law enforcement, just knights and soldiers, many of whom weren't all that interested in protecting you. If you weren't part of the nobility or a soldier, you were pretty much on your own. So whether you were sick, injured, or caught up in warfare, life in medieval times wasn't about surviving on your own terms. Your survival was often a matter of luck and circumstance, and the chances of living a long, peaceful life were slim. Historians still debate whether medieval violence was more intense than in other periods, but one thing is clear. It was an incredibly dangerous time to be alive. Whether from disease, poor medical care, or constant conflict, your chances of surviving the medieval ages weren't great. So, while you might think you could handle the rough lifestyle, the truth is, the odds were stacked so high against you, it would be a miracle if you made it to old age. Now that we've painted a grim picture of the everyday struggles of medieval life, where survival depended on everything from your birth status to the chances of escaping disease, let's turn our attention to something that was even more terrifying: travel. If you thought that living in one place was bad enough, think about how dangerous it was just to leave your home. Traveling in medieval times was nothing short of a death sentence for many, and the dangers you'd face on the road would have made staying put seem like the safer option. Imagine for a moment that you needed to travel to a neighboring town. Maybe you've heard of a market where you can sell your crops or buy some supplies. The idea of traveling sounds simple enough, right? Pack up your things, get on your horse, if you're lucky enough to have one, and set off on your journey. But the reality? Not so simple. The first major hurdle: the roads, or rather the lack of them. Unlike the modern highways and roads we take for granted, medieval roads were rough, unpaved, and full of obstacles. You'd be lucky if the path you were following was more than a muddy track, often rutted and bogged down by rain. That's right, no smooth asphalt roads to cruise on. Instead, you'd likely find yourself stumbling through thick mud, clambering over rocks, and dealing with treacherous weather conditions. The idea of a road trip would have seemed like a nightmare. And that's just the surface of it. Even if you somehow managed to make it through the rough terrain, you'd still have to contend with what's lurking around you. The threat of bandits was ever present. If you were traveling alone or with a small group, you were an easy target for highwaymen looking to rob and maybe even kill. The medieval world was full of lawlessness, and without a well-equipped army or a convoy of heavily armed guards, there was no guarantee that your journey would end in safety. Historically, thieves and robbers were known to ambush travelers, especially those carrying goods or money. These bandits knew how to pick off unsuspecting circums with ease. The only real protection for most travelers was joining a caravan or traveling with an armed escort, but even then, there was no guarantee you'd make it. And if the bandits didn't get you, wild animals like wolves or bears might be the next threat on your list. But bandits and animals weren't your only concerns. Disease, once again, was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike when you least expected it. The medieval world wasn't like today, where hospitals are just a phone call away. If you got sick on the road, you'd be forced to deal with it on your own, with very few options for help. If you managed to make it to a town, you might find a physician, but there's a good chance that they wouldn't know how to treat whatever illness you were facing, especially if it was something as deadly as the plague or smallpox. The road was no place for a sick person to recover. More often than not, traveling sick meant your death. But let's say you're lucky enough to avoid the robbers, wild animals, and diseases. You might still find yourself dealing with one last danger: starvation. Food wasn't always easy to come by, and what little you could find along the road was often stale, spoiled, or lacking in nutrients. Imagine walking for days, relying on dry bread or stale meat just to keep yourself going. If you couldn't find any food along the way, there was a chance you'd find yourself weak and unable to continue. And speaking of food, let's not forget about water. In the medieval world, clean drinking water was a rarity, especially on the move. Rivers were often contaminated with waste, and wells were sometimes poisoned or polluted. If you ran out of water during your journey, and there was a good chance you would, you could easily become dehydrated and ill. In fact, traveling could be so dangerous that some people would just opt to stay put, even if it meant missing out on important opportunities. Those who had to travel often took immense risks, gambling their lives for a chance at something better. And those who had the option to stay home, they probably stayed right where they were, thankful for the safety, however grim, of their own villages. The roads were simply too perilous. Historians still argue about whether medieval travel was more dangerous than the ancient world. Some suggest that travel was more hazardous due to the lack of infrastructure and protection, while others believe it was simply a part of life, something people had to deal with to survive. But one thing is clear: whether you were trying to reach a distant town or simply running errands, travel in the medieval world was nothing like the road trips we enjoy today. It was full of risks and dangers, with no guarantees of success or survival. So, while we might think of medieval times as an era of knights in shining armor and grand adventures, the reality was far less glamorous. Traveling was a deadly gamble, one that many people avoided altogether. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for people to spend their entire lives in the same village, never venturing farther than the borders of their land. Travel for many was simply too dangerous to be worth the effort, whether it was the threat of bandits, disease, starvation, or just the sheer physical difficulty of getting from one place to another. The idea of travel in medieval times was a far cry from the ease and luxury we experience today. Now that you've got a sense of how terrifying traveling was, let's dive into another equally daunting aspect of medieval life: the overwhelming influence of superstition and ignorance that dominated people's minds and daily actions. Imagine this. You're living in the 14th century, a time when knowledge was scarce, and every strange event was seen through a lens of fear and suspicion. The medieval world wasn't a place of enlightenment or scientific discovery. It was a world where magic, witchcraft, and religious zeal were at the core of most people's beliefs. Picture yourself as an average medieval villager, trying to make sense of the world around you. If you saw a strange cloud formation in the sky, you might think it's a bad omen. If someone sneezed, you'd probably make the sign of the cross to ward off evil spirits. If your cow suddenly got sick, it could very well be a sign of a curse or the work of a witch. The idea of science as we know it simply didn't exist. Instead, people turned to superstition and religion to explain the unexplainable. Let's start with the role of the church. In the Middle Ages, the church was an incredibly powerful institution. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was the center of all knowledge, education, and social order. The clergy were the ones who could read and write, while most of the population remained illiterate. The church often prescribed spiritual remedies for physical ailments, such as praying, fasting, or attending Mass. But if someone were possessed or had a mental illness, it was often seen as the work of demons. Exorcisms became a regular practice, and the church had an entire framework dedicated to the supernatural. If you were feeling off, a priest might suggest that a demon had taken hold of you, and the solution would be to pray for divine intervention or undergo an exorcism. Now let's talk about witches. The medieval world was obsessed with the idea of witchcraft, especially during the later parts of the Middle Ages. If you were a woman living in a small town and someone in the village fell ill or something went wrong, you might be accused of being a witch simply because you were different, or maybe just because you were unlucky. Witch hunts became increasingly common, and accusations of witchcraft were often enough to get you executed. Imagine the fear you would live with, knowing that one wrong look, one slip of the tongue, could send you to the gallows. Entire villages turned on each other, fueled by suspicion and panic. Historians still debate the roots of medieval witchcraft hysteria. Some suggest that it was a way for the church to maintain control over the population by scapegoating those who didn't conform to societal norms. Others believe it was tied to the idea of women being associated with evil or magic, a legacy that still impacts our society today, regardless of the cause. The fear of witches and magic became a defining feature of medieval life. People feared the unknown, and magic, whether real or imagined, was their way of explaining the inexplicable. But the superstition didn't stop at witches. The medieval world was full of strange and terrifying beliefs. People believed in ghosts, goblins, and monsters that lurked in the dark. They thought that illnesses were caused by the alignment of the stars or the wrath of the gods. If you were unlucky enough to suffer a misfortune, it was often blamed on supernatural forces. A bad harvest, surely the work of an angry god. A sudden death, perhaps the result of a curse. This fear of the unknown extended to almost every aspect of life. You wouldn't even be able to get sick without the looming threat of supernatural explanations. If you caught a fever or developed a painful rash, you'd probably consult a local healer who might suggest that you wear a charm, drink a potion, or perform a ritual to ward off evil. The knowledge of the body and medicine was limited, and the line between what was considered natural and supernatural was often blurred. But even beyond the fear of the supernatural, there was also the stark reality of ignorance. Without modern education or access to information, most people simply didn't have a basic understanding of how the world worked. People didn't know about germs, viruses, or bacteria. Diseases were still seen as punishments from the gods, and the idea that illness could be spread by contact was completely unknown. If you saw someone get sick, it was likely that you'd just chalk it up to divine punishment rather than trying to figure out why it was happening or how it could be prevented. And without the benefit of science, people often relied on dangerous practices that only exacerbated the problems they faced. Historians still debate whether the medieval period was more defined by ignorance or if it was simply a time of transition between ancient wisdom and modern science. Some believe that this period was just a dark chapter in human development, while others suggest that it was a necessary part of the process that led to the more enlightened periods that followed, like the Renaissance. Regardless of how it's viewed, one thing is clear: medieval superstition and ignorance had a profound impact on how people lived and thought. The very idea of knowledge was so limited that everything seemed to be governed by forces beyond your control. If you could make it through the constant threat of disease, the oppressive social system, and the fear of the supernatural, you might just have to deal with the ignorance that kept everyone in the dark, literally. In the medieval world, knowledge wasn't just inaccessible, it was actively suppressed. The church and the ruling powers often controlled access to learning, keeping the masses in ignorance so that they could maintain control. The unfortunate reality was that in this age, even the most basic understanding of the world around you was out of reach. By now, you've learned how the medieval world was filled with danger, disease, superstition, and ignorance. But there's one more layer to this grim tale: the role of women in medieval society. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't just a matter of physical health or protection from bandits. It was about navigating a world that often saw you as less than human, a mere vessel for reproduction and domestic labor. Your freedoms were limited, and the consequences of stepping out of line were severe. Let's start with the basics: your role in society. Whether you were a peasant, a noblewoman, or somewhere in between, your primary responsibility was to bear children and manage the household. The concept of women working outside the home was virtually non-existent. If you were a peasant, you spent your days working the fields, tending to animals, and helping your husband with whatever chores needed to be done. If you were a noblewoman, your job was a bit less physically demanding, but equally important: raising children, managing servants, and supporting your husband in his political or military endeavors. The idea of freedom for a medieval woman was a foreign concept. Your life was usually dictated by your father's and then your husband's wishes. Marriage, often arranged, was your ticket to a stable life, but it came with a cost. If you didn't marry well, you were in danger of being left without support in a world that offered little opportunity for women outside of the family. Divorce? Not an option. Women had very few rights, and any attempt to break free from the shackles of marriage or societal expectations was met with harsh judgment or punishment. Think about the sheer lack of agency a woman had during this time. If you were unmarried, you could be labeled a spinster, a social pariah, with few prospects for the future. But even married women had little control over their own bodies or their own fates. Your husband could decide what was best for you, from when and how often you would bear children, to where you would live and what your daily life would look like. If you didn't meet these expectations, you could easily fall out of favor, and with little to no support, your life would become a struggle for survival. But life wasn't just about following orders. Women were also expected to adhere to the strict moral codes of the time. If you were suspected of being impure, promiscuous, or unchaste, the consequences were often devastating. Medieval society was obsessed with the idea of virginity, and losing that could mean losing your place in society altogether. Women who were accused of adultery or fornication were often punished harshly. Public humiliation, beatings, and even execution were not unheard of in extreme cases. And even if you were the victim of abuse or infidelity, you had little recourse. Your voice, your testimony, would be disregarded in favor of your husband's or father's. Historians still debate how oppressive medieval society truly was for women. Some argue that the medieval period offered women more autonomy than we often give it credit for, particularly in roles like abbesses, in religious communities, or women who ran their own businesses. However, most scholars agree that the overwhelming majority of women lived under strict social and gender constraints. Women who did manage to find a bit of freedom, either in work or religion, were the exception, not the rule. But the most terrifying aspect of medieval life for women wasn't just the lack of freedom. It was the constant threat of violence. Whether it was domestic abuse, sexual assault, or the violent punishment of perceived moral failings, women were often seen as property. If you were a noble woman, you might be married off to cement political alliances, but even then, your voice in that decision was negligible. If you were a peasant woman, your marriage and life would likely be dictated by survival, with little concern for your personal desires or happiness. And if you were unfortunate enough to be accused of witchcraft, even the slightest hint of power or independence could get you killed. The medieval world wasn't just a man's world. It was a world where women were marginalized, controlled, and often punished for any attempt to step outside their prescribed role. You were either a wife, a mother, or a nun, and nothing more. The idea of a woman living a life independent from these roles was almost unheard of, whether it was working the land, maintaining the household, or enduring the physical toll of childbirth. Women's lives were about survival just as much as anyone else's, but they were expected to do so quietly, without complaint, and with little room for personal freedom. In the rare cases when women did break free of the expectations placed upon them, it was often as outliers. There were instances of women becoming leaders of religious orders, like the aforementioned abbesses, or even noblewomen who ran estates while their husbands were away at war. But for most women, life was a matter of survival, and survival meant conforming to the strict gender norms that dominated medieval society. What's even more tragic is that these gender norms, enforced by both society and the church, were upheld through brutal punishments. Women's bodies were seen as vessels, and any deviation from the strict roles set out for them was often seen as dangerous. In a world filled with disease, war, and superstition, women's lives were particularly fragile. Historians still debate the long-term impact of medieval gender roles. Some believe these practices were an unfortunate but necessary part of a social structure that prioritized survival above all else. Others argue that medieval society perpetuated harmful stereotypes and abuses that took centuries to overcome. Regardless of the debate, one thing is certain. As a woman in medieval times, you were expected to live a life dictated by others, with little to no control over your own future.